Artifact Dispatch. Varidane Field Containment Report. The Calf. Chapter 1. Initial Containment Report. Why I was there. This report concerns a containment action undertaken in a minor human settlement of no strategic relevance. The dispatch was triggered by the detection of a high-amplitude forced coupling event consistent with unsanctioned sorcerous activity. The signal rose abruptly, without preparation or buffering, and exhibited none of the stabilization characteristics associated with trained intervention. Its profile suggested urgency without competence. A sharp escalation, poorly shaped, localized in scope, indiscriminate in effect. No prior veil instability was recorded in the region. Instrumentation across the surrounding quiv showed no thinning, no harmonic shear, no pre-event disturbance that might indicate pressure from adjacent layers. No predatory presence was logged before the event window. No environmental anomaly preceded the signal. In other words, the system was quiet. The settlement was not under external threat. It was not under siege. It was not starving much, nor experiencing environmental collapse, nor approaching any threshold that would normally justify intervention. There was no breach, no infestation, no incursion from outside the local continuum. Nothing was pressing against the veil from beyond. The Aegis lattice registered only background fluctuation, weather patterns adjusting within seasonal bounds, population movement consistent with ordinary labor cycles, the ambient rise and fall of attention that accompanies human habitation. None of these indicators approached escalation thresholds. None required action. The initiating factor was internal. Human communities experience fluctuation as a matter of course. Resources vary. Weather resists prediction. Authority drifts as generations overlap and memory thins. Anticipation of loss often precedes loss itself by extended intervals. These conditions are not failures of the system. They are the system. They are the cost of existing within a framework that does not guarantee outcomes. Such conditions do not constitute emergencies. They do not require correction at the level of reality. They are typically addressed through adaptation, redistribution of effort, patience or acceptance. None of these responses produce significant signal. In this instance, none of them were selected. A small subset of the settlement elected instead to impose control where tolerance would have sufficed. The decision was not unanimous. It was not the result of extended deliberation. It arose gradually, through repetition rather than debate, and was framed locally as decisive action taken in the face of uncertainty. The language used did not reference harm. It referenced prevention, correction, alignment. The intent, as articulated, was stabilizing rather than destructive. Responsibility was emphasized, foresight was claimed, necessity was asserted. The method chosen, however, was sufficient to escalate a non-event into a reportable incident within a single cycle. The distinction between intent and method is not philosophical, it is operational. Reality responds to structure, not aspiration. Effects propagate according to mechanics, not justification. The veil does not evaluate motive. It yields or resists based solely on how it is treated. I was assigned because escalation had occurred, not because it was warranted. Nothing was wrong. Then they decided something was. Chapter 2. Baseline Conditions. Life.
The region did what regions do when nothing is happening. It varied. Cloud came and unmade itself. Wind remembered a direction, forgot it, tried another. The light slid around the slopes in slow, ordinary ways, as if it had always been agreed between sky and ground, and nobody had thought to put it in writing. If you watched long enough, you could convince yourself there were patterns, but you can do that with smoke and bored people. The settlement sat inside that drift, without any special emphasis. It existed. It continued. Drought is not an event. It is a schedule. It did not arrive with a sound. It did not announce itself. It simply left less behind each day. Less damp in the soil when a finger went in. Less weight in the air when you breathed. Less give in the plants when a hand tried to coax them upright. The work changed around those absences in the same way a body changes around an old injury. Not with drama, but with small compensations that become habit. When the sun sharpened, shade was not sought so much as occupied, as naturally as a hand occupies a tool. A basket was shifted 2 feet to avoid direct light. A strip of cloth was moved to cover a jar mouth, then moved back when the breeze tried to take it. A reed bundle was laid flat instead of propped, because the wind had begun to argue. A child was guided under an overhang without anyone speaking about it, because there are only so many ways to keep a child from turning into a sunburnt crisp. Weather continued. Adaptation continued. Water was not treated like treasure. Not yet. It was treated like work. The queue formed where the queue always formed, not because anyone loved queuing, but because the ground there was beaten level by years of feet. Containers came in pairs when a household still had 2 worth carrying, came singly when it didn't. Hands rinsed before filling, not after, because the point was to keep the vessel clean, not the skin. The same path was taken with slightly tighter attention at the loosened edges where the soil had cracked and slumped. Someone tested a footing with a stick, then stepped where the stick said to step. Someone else waited half a heartbeat longer than usual before moving forward. A small friction flared. Whose turn? Whose place? Whose patience? Then it smoothed itself, not through any lofty commitment to fairness, but through the older, simpler practice of continuing. Water was obtained. Distribution continued. People carried it back the way you carry a thing you will need again tomorrow. Not reverently, not carelessly, but accurately. Spillage was corrected without scolding. A strap was retied. A knot was tightened. A shoulder took the weight and did not complain out loud. The day held. The sky's mood changed twice in the morning, and each time the village rearranged by inches. When cloud thickened, a few tasks drifted outward. When it thinned, those tasks drifted back in. Work did not pause for contemplation of omens. Work paused for breath, for the brief easing of a calf muscle, for the adjustment of a grip on a handle that had been repaired too many times to be considered whole. The settlement did not interpret the sky. It used it. Soil was checked the way you check anything that can betray you, repeatedly, without ceremony. A clod was broken open and looked at. Fingers rubbed it, feeling for damp that wasn't there. A shoot was turned, examined, set back as if returned to the earth with apologies that were never spoken. Seeds were held back, then reconsidered, then held back again. A tool bit into ground that gave less than it used to. The pace stayed steady, because steady is what keeps you from wasting yourself. Labour continued. Yield remained unknown. Here's the hard truth of it. Stores were not counted because people love counting. They were counted because numbers are the only promises you can make that don't require anyone to believe you. A clay seal was pressed flat, then pressed again, because the first press might have been lazy. A bundle was shifted from one corner to another to keep it away from the wall where damp sometimes crept in, even in drought, because life is inconsistent that way. Someone retalied, quietly, lips moving without sound. Someone else watched the watching, not with suspicion, just with the familiar attention that comes from living in a place where everyone's hands matter. A portion was negotiated down by a handful of grain. Another portion was negotiated up by a pinch of salt. No one made a speech about sacrifice. Stores remained. Distribution remained orderly. The calf existed inside this economy of breath and measure as an ordinary fact with legs. It was tethered where it had always been tethered, the rope worn smooth at the point where it rubbed the post. Its enclosure was not a pen of cruelty or care. It was a shape of convenience, built to keep an asset from becoming a loss. Feed was measured by eye and habit. The calf keeper checked the animal's flank with 2 fingers, pressure, release, then moved on. The rope was shortened, then lengthened, because the animal needed room to turn, but not enough room to be clever. The calf nosed at the ground, then at the keeper's sleeve, then settled into the small, practical business of being alive. Calf alive, present, unexceptional. Authority moved through the settlement like any other resource, unevenly distributed, handled often, argued over in low voices. A gathering happened where shade and habit met, near a wall that caught breeze, near a fire that was, at this point, more ash than flame. Some people stood, because standing lets you leave faster. Others waited, because waiting is what you do when the voice that speaks first hasn't spoken yet. When that voice did speak, it did not speak like thunder. It spoke like someone arranging tools on a shelf. This goes here, that goes there. We will do this next. We will not do that now. Turn-taking followed a pattern worn into the air. Interruptions happened, as they do, and were absorbed not by grace, but by repetition. Say it again. Say it clearer. Say it so the ones at the edge can pretend they heard the first time. Order was maintained. Speech concluded. Success. Leadership in security, however, does not always look like shouting. Often, it looks like detail. A rule was given with an extra clause. A task was assigned with a reminder attached. Compliance was checked twice, then checked again under the pretext of helping. A minor correction became a small performance, the leader's hands lingering a fraction longer than necessary, as if touch could transmit authority. The people receiving it did what people do, nodded, adjusted, moved on. Authority held. Routines resumed. Conflict surfaced the way splinters surface, small, sharp, irritating, not fatal. Initially. A dispute over access ran its short course and resolved through habit. Deference to the older, trade between the equal, avoidance for the stubborn, compromise for the tired. No one escalated because escalation costs energy, and energy is already spent before noon. Conflict closed. Nothing escalated. Privation leaves a residue in minds the way smoke leaves it on stone. You do not see it from a distance, but you taste it when you are close. There were private talks, the ones that happen in any group of humans pressed long enough into the same corner of circumstance. A few people stepped away and made a small circle out of their bodies. An object was handled and rehandled as words were repeated. Attention was checked. The cluster dispersed. The day continued. And threaded through that talk was the approaching dark. An eclipse is a clockwork shadow. It arrives whether you deserve it or not. To people who have lived through cycles of loss, a scheduled darkness still looks like the sky just changing its mind. The Veilthari, however, are so dispassionate about the phenomenon that they will go out of their way to watch one in person, not to plead with it or ward it off, but to be entertained. They treat it as an event in the ordinary sense, something to plan for, travel to, talk over afterwards, perhaps even make a small game of, in the quiet way they make games of most things. It was spoken of in fragments, in the half-phrases people use when they don't want to be the one who names a fear out loud. At midday, and then a hand gesture. The light, and then a glance upward, as if the sky might be caught listening. Some laughed too sharply, some spat to the side, some did nothing. Away from the wider group, the chief sat with the shaman in a posture that tried to look like inevitability. His fear was not larger than anyone else's, it was just better dressed. He spoke of rain in the same tone he used to speak of obedience. He spoke of the gods, as if they were a council he chaired. He made the expected offering with the expected seriousness. And then he slid a second request into the space, like a hand into a pocket. The talk remained talk. No declaration was made, no enactment followed. The day continued. By the end of the interval, the system remained quiet. Ordinary variance persisted without accumulation. No discontinuity presented. No event occurred. The settlement remained stable, non-anomalous, and continued into its day. If only the humans had seen it that way.
Chapter 3. The Human Response. Panic as a Tool.
Nothing changed. The sky did not revise its position. The soil did not discover new generosity. The wind remained committed to being unhelpful in the same ways it had been all morning. Work continued, because work is what holds the edges of a day together. What shifted was not the world, but the distance people allowed between one thought and the next. Conversations shortened, not because there was less to say, but because patience began to cost more than speech. Questions were asked before their owners had finished forming them. Answers arrived half-assembled, and were accepted anyway, because an answer is better than a pause. People stopped saying if. They began saying when. The eclipse had been gone for days, in the abstract way future weather comes and goes. Counted, noted, set aside. Although, now it began to appear in places it had not been invited. It slipped into talk about water. It leaned against conversations about stores. It was mentioned while adjusting a strap or retightening a knot, as if it had always belonged there. Someone said, the last time the light went wrong, the crops failed. The water counter nodded, not because they remembered that, but because nodding keeps a story moving. The reed cutter added that it had been worse than that. No one asked how either of them knew. The point was not accuracy. The point was containment. The eclipse had become relevant in all the wrong ways. Not sacred. Not unknowable. Relevant, which is more dangerous. Because a thing of relevance, as is so often the case, is also a thing that might be addressed. Authority responded the way authority does when it senses itself thinning. The voice that speaks first called people in again, sooner than planned, with less preamble. The words were familiar, but the order had changed. Where there had been reassurance, talk was now of prevention. Where there had been patience, talk was now urgency, dressed up as foresight. Questions were allowed. The right ones were even welcomed. The answers, however, did not change. Each reply returned in the same shape, smoothed by repetition until it felt deliberate. Unfortunately for the people of this settlement, this worked. Repetition passed for clarity. Confidence passed for understanding. People relaxed into the sensation that something was being handled. Responsibility shifted upward, where it could be stored and not looked at too closely. The problem was named. The responsibility was assigned. Once the shape of authority had been stabilized, the specialists were approached. 2. Not ceremonially. Efficiently. The shaman were treated less like intermediaries and more like tools with opinions. They were asked what could be done, not whether it should be. The first request was loud and public. Rain. The word was allowed to carry, because that is what words do when they are meant to reassure more than inform. Later, when the group had thinned, the secondary matters surfaced. The chief spoke in a lower voice, the one reserved for maintenance. He spoke about a very gender-specific potency, as if it were a joint that had begun to ache. Temporary, correctable, embarrassing only if ignored. An offering was made. Then another, smaller one, set down without comment. Something edible, something tradable. Something that said, "This is not a strange request. People ask for this all the time." The shaman received it the way people do when they are paid to remain neutral. They did not laugh. They did not refuse. They listened, faces arranged into usefulness. They spoke about limits, about effort, about conditions. This was not assent. It was the professional suspension of refusal. They agreed only that something might be attempted. Pressure did the rest. Options were discussed quickly, not thoroughly. Faster methods rose to the surface because speed is easy to agree on. Slower approaches were mentioned, acknowledged, and set aside without ceremony. No one argued with them. They simply looked at the ground long enough for the moment to pass. Costs were counted where counting was possible. Grain, labour, attention. Things that could not be measured were not entered into the ledger. Emotion was reframed as focus. Urgency became a virtue. Consent did not vanish. It softened the way edges do when handled too often in a short time. No one said force. They spoke about effectiveness. They spoke about certainty. They spoke about not wanting to look back later and wish they had acted sooner. When the talk turned to resources, the tone flattened. This was not the part of the conversation where people raise their voices. This was inventory. Again, nothing changed. Yet.
Chapter 4. The Ritual. Method over Meaning.
Once the decision existed, it began to behave like a schedule, as decisions are wont to do. People moved differently around it, not faster exactly, but with fewer revisions. Tasks were taken up and completed without commentary, as if commentary might slow them down. The day narrowed. Options that had once been available were no longer noticed. The space was chosen simply because it always had been. Shade, distance from dwellings, but not so much distance that it felt like exile. A patch of ground worn smooth by use that had nothing to do with this, which helped. Nothing looks more legitimate than repetition. The ash carrier arrived first because they always did. They knelt and tested the ground with their palm, then brushed aside a pebble that would have been irritating later. The pebble was placed carefully at the edge, not discarded. It might be needed to weigh something down. Everything might be needed. The reed cutter followed, bundles balanced against a shoulder that had learned the shape of them. The reeds were laid out and rearranged, then rearranged again. Alignment mattered, not because anyone could explain why, but because misalignment was an error you could see, and visible errors are easier to correct than invisible ones. The water counter arrived with vessels measured by habit rather than mark. They set them down and adjusted their spacing twice, frowning, then adjusted them back to where they had been. This was noted by no one, which was a relief. The shaman came together, not as a procession, but as convergence. They carried nothing that could not be explained as useful. No symbols, no adornment, only tools, and the absence of tools they had decided not to bring. They spoke little, not because words were forbidden, but because words tend to invite discussion. Discussion had been completed. The calf keeper arrived last. This was not intentional. The rope had needed retying. The knot had been inspected, then inspected again, because knots are treacherous things and tend to reveal their intentions at inconvenient times. The calf followed with the mild irritation of an animal that knows it is being moved for reasons that have nothing to do with it. It resisted once, briefly. Not out of fear, but because the ground smelled different here, and animals are conservative in their preferences. The calf keeper adjusted their grip, murmured nothing useful, and applied pressure until movement resumed. This was not cruelty. This was efficiency. The calf was positioned. The rope was shortened, then lengthened. Too much slack invited wandering. Too little invited noise. Noise was not desired. No one addressed the animal directly, not out of hardness, but because addressing it would require deciding what tone to use. The voice that speaks first spoke again, briefly, to establish sequence. Not meaning. Sequence. First this, then that. Do not pause between. If something goes wrong, correct it and continue. The shaman began their work. They did not chant. Chanting would have implied expectation. They spoke in measured phrases, counted under the breath, the way people do when lifting something heavy, and shared. Rhythm was introduced deliberately, not for beauty, for coordination. The air changed, not in substance but in attention. People leaned without realizing they had leaned. Breath synchronized accidentally. A foot shifted to match a cadence that was not meant to be followed. Emotion was introduced deliberately, not named, loaded. The water counter was asked to remember a time the vessels had come back light. The ash carrier was asked to recall a winter that had lingered too long. The reed cutter was prompted with a story everyone knew and no one wanted to tell properly. None of this was theatrical. It was practical. Feeling has weight. Weight can be applied. The chief stood slightly apart, where they could be seen but not touched. Their posture was correct. Their face held the appropriate expression for gravity without panic. A difficult balance, and one that took effort to maintain. When their attention wandered, it was redirected. Gently. A hand gesture, a repeated phrase. Focus was required from everyone, especially from the one who had insisted on this. The calf sensed the change. It shifted, stamped once. The rope tightened. The calf keeper adjusted their stance and applied steady pressure, the kind that suggests inevitability rather than threat. The animal stilled. Not because it understood, but because resistance had not been rewarded. The shaman marked the ground, not with symbols, not yet, with distances. Steps counted heel to toe, placements measured by reach. Everything had to be where it was meant to be, because rearranging later would break the flow, and breaking the flow was not advised. The humour arrived briefly, uninvited. Someone miscounted and had to start again. Someone else corrected them too quickly and earned a look. The ash carrier snorted once, quietly, at the absurdity of caring this much about where a line was drawn on dirt that would be scuffed flat by evening anyway. No one laughed. The procedure continued. The words tightened. The rhythm held. Attention narrowed to the work itself, which is how people endure things they do not want to examine too closely. The calf breathed. The rope held. The shaman reached the point where preparation becomes action. They did not announce it. They began. The ritual was enacted.
Chapter 5. The Sacrifice. Why this counts.
The ritual did not accelerate once it began. This disappointed several people, though no one said so. There is a common belief that once something difficult is underway, it will hurry itself along out of courtesy. Like so many of the events described here, this belief has no foundation. The shaman maintained the rhythm they had set, not faster, not slower. The cadence was chosen to hold attention without exhausting it. Anything quicker would fray. Anything slower would invite thought. Thought was most definitely not wanted. The ash carrier was instructed to step closer, not because the ash was insufficient, but because proximity mattered. The ash did not do anything by itself. It marked where effort was being applied. It was bookkeeping. The ash carrier complied, adjusting their footing twice before settling. Their hands shook slightly, then stopped when they noticed them doing it. This was corrected the way people correct small errors, by pretending they had intended the correction all along. The water counter was told to wait. This was harder. Waiting is not passive in these moments. It is an active refusal to do something helpful. The vessels were held at the ready, arms beginning to ache. The water counter shifted the weight from one foot to the other and back again, careful not to spill. Spilling would have been a mistake, and mistakes had started to feel expensive. The calf breathed. It had settled into the rope with the reluctant patience of an animal that has learned resistance is temporary. Its sides moved in a steady, unremarkable rhythm. This rhythm did not align with the one the shaman were maintaining. Someone noticed. No one said anything. The calf keeper adjusted their grip again, not tighter, more certain. The rope did not need force. It needed confidence. Animals understand confidence. They do not understand plans. The voice that speaks first said a word that meant now, but was not now. It was the word you use when something is about to matter. The shaman shifted their stance. This was the moment where explanation might once have lived. It had been discussed earlier, briefly, in the abstract. Not why this worked, but how it was supposed to proceed. The explanation had not survived contact with the present. What remained was procedure. Emotion was increased, deliberately. The chief was prompted again, this time less gently. He complied, speaking of loss with greater specificity. Names were not used, but details were. A field that had failed, a night spent awake listening to a roof complain. The particular humiliation of being watched while hoping. This was effective. The air tightened, not thickened, tightened, the way fabric does when pulled evenly from both ends. The reed cutter became aware of their own breathing and tried to correct it. This did not help. Correcting breath draws attention to breath, and attention was already over-allocated. Someone laughed. It was brief, involuntary, a short bark of sound that surprised its owner as much as anyone else. It had been triggered by the absurdity of how serious everyone suddenly looked, bent over reeds and ash and a calf that had done nothing wrong. The laugh stopped immediately. No one addressed it. Addressing it would have made it larger. The moment was allowed to pass, brittle and uncollected, like a dropped bead no one wanted to bend down for. The shaman did not react. They were watching alignment. Not mystical alignment, practical alignment, where attention was pooling, where resistance remained, where expectation had begun to outrun control. The water counter was given the signal. They stepped forward, vessels trembling, and stopped where they were told to stop. Close enough to matter. Far enough to retreat if retreat were still an option. It was not. The calf's breathing changed. This was the first thing that truly unsettled people, because it was not supposed to. Animals are meant to be predictable in these moments. When they are not, it suggests that something has been miscalculated. The shaman did not correct for this. They did not need to. The procedure accounted for unwillingness. It did not require cooperation, only presence. The ritual continued. Up to this point, the work had been difficult but ordinary. People had arranged things. They had remembered instructions. They had stood where they were told to stand and spoken when prompted. This had required attention, but not belief. Belief is heavier than attention, and it tires faster. The shaman slowed the rhythm. Not dramatically, just enough that everyone noticed the space between one beat and the next. In that space, expectation began to stretch. The calf stood where it had been placed. Its breathing was steady again. The rope lay with the slight curve that meant it was neither slack nor pulling. The calf keeper kept one hand on the line. Not to restrain, to reassure. Animals trust continuity. The rope had not lied to it yet. This was not accidental. The shaman had chosen the calf because it belonged here. Not symbolically, practically. It was fed by hands everyone recognized. It had been moved, cleaned, tethered, and released 100 times. Its presence carried no warning. Trust is not announced. It is accumulated. The water counter became aware, suddenly, of how quiet everyone was. Even the small noises had thinned. A throat cleared and sounded too loud. A foot scraped and was lifted quickly, apologetically, as if the ground might take offence. The shaman adjusted again. They were not forcing power. They were tuning it. The world, as it is usually experienced, has a tolerable level of background noise. Small disagreements in timing. Minor variations in pressure. These do not matter. They cancel out. They keep things flexible. What they were doing now was removing that slack. Emotion was brought closer. Not heightened yet, aligned. The chief was asked to speak again, and did, because refusal would have felt worse than compliance. He spoke of the past dark with more certainty than he felt. Certainty carries better. The words came out sharper, edged with urgency that was beginning to look like anger. This was useful. Attention tightened around the sound. Fear, when shared, synchronizes easily. It pulls minds into step the way marching does, even when no one has agreed on the destination. The air responded. Not visibly. No one felt a breeze or saw a shimmer. What changed was the way the space seemed to listen. The silence was no longer empty. It had direction. The reed cutter swallowed and said, very quietly, that it felt like standing too close to a drum. This was not helpful. And they stopped talking. The shaman continued. They were not summoning anything. They were creating a pressure differential, a place where harmony could no longer resolve itself naturally. The rhythm pressed forward. The emotion pressed with it. Everything that did not fit was squeezed thinner. The calf shifted. This time, the movement was met immediately. The calf keeper corrected without hesitation, a smooth, practiced motion that had been used before to stop wandering, to keep the animal out of trouble. The rope tightened. The calf stilled. Trust held. This mattered. Expectation settled into the shape of the moment. Everyone present knew what was supposed to happen next, even if they could not have said it aloud. This knowledge sat behind the eyes, warm and certain, the way habits do. The shaman leaned into that expectation. They did not announce the transition. They let it arrive. The harmony they had been building began to strain. Not because it was failing, but because it was being asked to carry more than it wanted to. The pressure sharpened. The alignment grew rigid. Somewhere beyond anyone present, something noticed. Not because it was called, because dissonance carries. Perfect harmony is quiet. Discord travels. The first sound the calf made was not fear, it was surprise. The knife moved when it was not expected to. They did not kill an animal. They violated an expectation. The act completed.
Chapter 6. Consequence. Reality Objects.
Something failed. Not with force, not with spectacle, and not with any sense of completion. What failed did so in the manner of systems that continue operating after their premises have quietly ceased to hold. The ritual did not end when its purpose ended. It continued because continuation was the only remaining instruction it possessed. At first, the failure presented as resistance. The shaman felt it in the cadence as drag, a fractional delay where response should have been immediate. Breath returned a moment late. Words did not seat themselves as cleanly into the air. The rhythm still held, but it required effort now, and that effort was no longer being returned in proportion. This was interpreted as difficulty. Difficulty invites persistence. The settlement leaned into the work. Fear thickened, attention pooled, repetition became insistence. Each participant acted locally, but the structure receiving their effort was not local. It responded only to aggregate pressure, not intention. Meaning was compressed, not into clarity, into density. The veil registered this compression as load, not as injury, and not as offence, simply as sustained stress applied across a boundary not designed to carry it indefinitely. At first, redistribution was graceful. Minor distortions absorbed the strain. Adjacent states adjusted alignment by margins too small to be registered by bodies accustomed to assuming continuity. Sound remained sound, space remained space, memory remained memory. The problem was not the first cycle. The problem was the refusal to stop. The ritual crossed the threshold where it functioned as communication and entered the phase where it functioned as application. The distinction mattered. Communication presumes response. Application presumes compliance. Reality does not comply. It equilibrates. The veil stretched accordingly, not uniformly. Stress never distributes uniformly unless forced to, and nothing was forcing it to yet. Micro-instabilities formed where coherence had already been thinned by repetition, fear, and the sustained compression of attention. These were not wounds, they were weaknesses, places where alignment required effort rather than occurring naturally. Sound was the first system to show measurable deviation. Echoes arrived fractionally late. Overtones lingered without source. The cadence seemed to lose track of itself between beats, not skipping, but hesitating, as though waiting for confirmation that never arrived. Space followed. Depth stopped agreeing with approach. Objects appeared slightly closer when reached for, and slightly farther away when ignored. The inconsistency was small enough to be dismissed, large enough to irritate. People adjusted without noticing they were adjusting. Memory followed after that. Nothing was lost. Loss would have been obvious. Instead, recall ceased to align cleanly with the present. Participants remembered performing the ritual. They remembered why it had begun. They were less certain about what it had been meant to accomplish in detail. Earlier stages felt incomplete, as though a step had been skipped that had not seemed important at the time. This uncertainty fed back into effort. More repetition, more emphasis, more insistence. The veil yielded, not as a tear, as a defect. The failure point did not announce itself. There was no sound, no visible distortion that could be named and shared. What formed was a discontinuity so small it would have gone unnoticed if it had not persisted. A needle hole. Not an opening, not a passage. A point where adjacent states failed to resolve into agreement. At the scale it existed, intention was irrelevant. No energy was required to hold it open. Its persistence was not maintained by force, but by topology. Once created, it behaved like any other path. It remained a path because something had already passed through it, even if that something had only been pressure. The settlement did not see it. They felt it as absence. The air lost a quality no one had known how to name until it was gone. Sound flattened slightly. Light stopped settling where it should. Attention drifted toward a place no one could quite identify, the way the eye is drawn to asymmetry without conscious decision. People became aware of being aware. This awareness did not clarify. It distracted. The ritual collapsed shortly after, not because it was interrupted, but because it could no longer lock. The cadence spun once, twice, seeking resonance that was no longer present. Words returned to mouths without amplification. Breath returned to bodies without consequence. The work stopped. What had been done did not. The needle hole remained. Small in stature, loud in structure, and completely, utterly unresolved. It behaved less like a wound and more like an object that had not existed before and now did. Not expanding, not closing, simply present, one moment where it wasn't in the previous, asserting disagreement by continuing to be a place where alignments of the universe failed. The veil did not repair itself. Of course it didn't. Such things do not do so on their own. Repair requires intention. The veil responds only to load, and the load had already been redistributed. The defect had become part of the system's current state. Around it, ordinary processes continued. Wind moved, people breathed, grazers grazed. Conversation resumed in fragments, thinner than before. The settlement attempted to reassert narrative control, to explain what had happened, to locate cause, and assign fault. Explanations slid off the experience without purchase. The breach did not respond to being named. It did not respond to being ignored. It existed as a mechanical fact. And because it existed, it was noticed. Not by the settlement, by something whose attention did not behave the way human attention does. Day N42 arrived without traversal. There was no approach to observe and no boundary that could be identified as crossed. One moment, the space contained only the settlement, the breach, and the after effects of the ritual's collapse. The next, it also contained Day N42. This was not concealment, it was not speed, it was not displacement. The difference mattered. Human perception assumes continuity as default and treats interruption as event. Vari Dayen presence operates on a different premise. Continuity is conditional. Context is primary. When conditions permit presence, presence occurs. When conditions require presence, presence occurs. The mind of the nearest observer performed the correction first. Their gaze passed over Day N42, failed to categorize what it was seeing, returned, and adjusted. Scale recalibrated. Distance revised itself. The observer's posture changed without instruction, shoulders lowering slightly, as if gravity had increased by a small but undeniable amount. Others followed. Not all at once. Awareness propagated unevenly, like pressure through a loosely packed medium. Day N42 did not announce themselves, for Day N42 did not seek attention. Attention organized itself around them anyway. They were tall, though tall was an inadequate descriptor. Height implied comparison, and comparison implied shared frame. Measurement failed not because Day N42 exceeded expectation, but because expectation had been calibrated for bodies that existed entirely within local agreement. Day N42 existed within agreement only incidentally. They were Vari Dayen, not a title, not a rank, a classification used by later systems attempting to impose order retroactively. At the time, the only relevant distinction was this. Day N42 did not require narrative placement in order to be present. Their coherence did not depend on belief, recognition, or response. They did not look at the breach immediately. This was the first point of misunderstanding for the humans who would later attempt to recount the event. The instinct to focus on the defect was strong. It felt obvious. It felt urgent. Day N42, however, completely ignored it and assessed the environment instead. Their awareness distributed itself across the settlement, sampling tension and alignment. They felt the residue of attention that had been compressed and released. They registered the probability mass that had already shifted and would not return on its own. They noted the breach only as one element in a broader pattern of strain. The breach did not interest them as an anomaly. It interested them as a consequence. Time behaved differently in their presence, not slowed and not accelerated, de-emphasized. Moments that would later be remembered as sequential occurred without clear ordering. Several witnesses would later disagree about who noticed Day N42 first. All of them would be wrong. Day N42 moved. Not abruptly, not hesitantly. Their movement merely assumed accommodation. Space, having learned better than to argue with the Vari Den, of course complied. They did not acknowledge the ritual circle. The markings, the ash, the carefully maintained geometry were irrelevant at this scale. Shape without authority does not constrain Vari Den behavior. One of the shaman raised their hands in a gesture older than the settlement itself. Fingers curved, wrists angled precisely. The motion had been effective in other contexts. It had redirected attention. It had established hierarchy. They believed it had warded off evil. Den 42 did not respond to the gesture. The hands lowered anyway. There was no visible force applied, no impact, no violence. The correction occurred at the level of posture and intention. The shaman did not remember deciding to comply. They only remembered standing differently. Speech attempted to assert itself next. The chief opened their mouth. Sound emerged thin and fractured, as though the air had lost confidence in the idea of carrying it. The chief tried again, offended at their own failure. The second attempt fared no better. Den 42 did not look at them. They were not ignoring the chief. Ignoring would have implied relevance. They were listening elsewhere. Vari Den perception does not prioritize individuals. It samples systems. The settlement registered as a collection of interacting stresses rather than discrete actors. Fear, exhaustion, confusion, residual insistence. These were not moral states, they were measurable conditions. Isolation began without announcement. Two of the shaman found themselves suddenly separated by several paces. Not dragged, not displaced violently, simply relocated, as if the universe had decided their previous positions had ceased to be available. An empty space interposed itself where one of them attempted to step. The space felt occupied without being filled, and just like that, the ritual cadence collapsed. Not interrupted, terminated, like vibration damped at exactly the correct node. Human contribution ceased. Unfortunately, the breach remained. Den 42 regarded it then, fully and without urgency. They did not yet act. Action would have been premature. Presence was sufficient for now. The Vari Den do not rush consequences. They catalogue them. Den 42 did not look at the breach first. They listened. Not with ears, not even with attention as humans understand it. Their awareness distributed itself across the environment, sampling tension, coherence, alignment. The settlement experienced time as sequence. Den 42 experienced it as a field already under strain. They felt what had been done. They felt what was continuing to happen despite the ritual's collapse. They felt the probability mass that had already shifted and would not return without intervention. The difficult part was not seeing futures. It was sorting which futures were real enough to matter and which ones would most effectively bring an end to the dissonance the ritual had caused. Because one unavoidable future was already beginning to play out, much to the detriment of the settlement's humans. And so, with the human contribution now severed, the deeper work became possible. Not easier. Possible. The breach, still small but structurally loud, held its disagreement with the world like a needle held in cloth, making a point by simply existing.
Chapter 7. Secondary Effects. Predation.
The breach existed, and the settlement did what settlements do when confronted with something they did not plan for. It tried to make it part of the plan. At first, this was not difficult, because the breach did not perform for them. It did not glow. It did not roar. It did not throw heat or light or meaning. It simply occupied a point in the air where the air stopped agreeing with itself. People looked at it and then looked away. Not out of bravery, but because the eyes did not know how to hold it. Focus slid. Depth misbehaved. A gaze would land and then skid, as if the mind had stepped onto wet stone. The shaman did what they had been doing all along. They continued. The method demanded continuation. Stopping would have been an admission, and admissions are expensive in front of a crowd. Rhythm was maintained, tightened, adjusted, as if the right cadence could persuade the world to stop objecting. For a short time, the circle held. The breach held too. It did not widen, not in any visible way. It simply remained. A small wrongness, with the patience of a crack in a pot that will not stop being a crack just because you glare at it. The first change arrived in the form of nothing happening, again. Rain did not come. The sky did not shift into sympathy. The light did not soften. The drought remained on schedule, faintly offended by the idea that it might somehow be negotiable. That failure would have been manageable. People endure disappointment daily. It is one of the settlement's core competencies, What they did not endure well was the second failure. The failure of their own bodies to behave normally in the presence of their solution. It began as a heaviness, a slackening, a sense that the limbs had been filled with wet sand when no one was looking. The reed cutter rubbed their forearm as if they had been bitten by something small. The water counter blinked too often and blamed the light. The ash carrier sat down without intending to, and then looked around as if sitting down might be taken as a statement. The chief watched this with irritation that tried to become authority. "Stand," they said, to someone who had not sat. The command landed poorly. It was difficult to sound commanding when the day itself was ignoring you. People complied anyway, because compliance is reflex, and reflex is comforting. The malaise spread in the ordinary way rumours spread, not through a sudden leap, through small contacts, shared air, shared attention, shared fear. By evening, it had acquired explanation. It was the smoke. It was the heat. It was hunger. It was that one jar that had tasted wrong last week. It was the eclipse approaching. It was the gods being slow, which was always the gods' favourite trait when things went badly. The settlement's imagination was an efficient machine. Under pressure, it produces causes in bulk. The shaman did not offer an explanation. They continued working. Their faces held the particular blankness of specialists whose tools have begun to do something outside the manual. They adjusted the procedure. They tightened the rhythm. They tried to push the wrongness back into whatever place wrongness comes from. The breach did not respond like a problem being solved. It responded like a pressure being equalized. In higher orders of the world, there are gradients that do not care about names. Heat moves toward cold. Water moves toward emptiness. Attention moves towards signal. When the boundary that keeps those gradients separate is intact, the movement is limited to the expected domains. When it is punctured, even slightly, the movement begins. Not as a dramatic invasion, as a drift, a grazing. The first of the grazers did not arrive like a creature entering a room. It intersected. There was no footfall, no shadow at the edge of vision, no monster silhouette obliging the imagination. The only sign was that a place near the breach began to feel as if it had been listened to too closely. People stepped away from that sensation without deciding to. The circle loosened. Spacing increased by inches. No one announced the movement. No one claimed to be afraid. They simply gave the air more room. The breach remained small. The effect did not. If you had tried to describe it to someone without language for layers, you might have said this: it felt like being too near a loud instrument you could not hear. The body, hearing nothing, nonetheless braced. Muscles tightened and then sagged. Breath shortened. Thoughts lost their edges. It became hard to hold on to intent. The water counter found themselves staring at their own hands as if hands were newly complicated objects with unclear purpose. Later, they would insist they had been fine. They would say they had simply been tired. This was not a lie. It was a translation. The grazer did not want their flesh. It did not want blood or bone or anything that could be carried away in a mouth. It wanted coherence. The thing that makes a mind a single mind rather than a loose bundle of reflexes. The thing that holds memory in place. The thing that makes a person the same person across an hour, across a night, across the span of a life. That coherence has texture. It has rhythm. It has patterns. That coherence also has energy, and energy can be consumed. It rises and sharpens under fear. It tightens and brightens under concentrated emotion. The ritual had created a spike of it, held in a rigid shape, and then punctured the boundary that kept that spike private. To the grazer, this was not a tragedy. It was dinner. The feeding was not violent. That was the most unsettling part. Violence gives you a script. Violence tells you where to look and what to do with your hands. This was closer to exposure, like walking too long in cold wind, only realizing your skin has stopped working properly after you have stripped off the last of your clothing. The first symptoms remained plausible: a headache without injury, a chill without fever, a fatigue that arrived like a decision made on your behalf. Someone tried to eat and found chewing felt like labor. Someone tried to laugh and discovered laughter had become an unfamiliar shape their face did not want to make. Someone tried to speak and stumbled over a word they had used daily since childhood. They corrected themselves quickly, embarrassed. And the embarrassment spiked the very thing the grazer was there for. That was the third failure. The settlement began to feed the problem with its attempts to recognize it. By the next morning, the malaise was no longer isolated. It had become a pattern, which meant it had become discussable. People gathered in clusters, comparing symptoms as if symptoms were coins. The humour here went stale quickly. Someone suggested it was the spirits of the calf taking revenge. Someone else said the calf had never been clever enough for revenge and earned a brief, brittle laugh. The laugh ended too fast. It left behind the uncomfortable awareness that everyone was trying to be normal on purpose. Normal takes effort when you have to remember how. The shaman returned to the breach and found it unchanged. Small, incapable of being stared into shape. They adjusted the circle again. They placed new markers. They increased the emotional load. Because force is what you reach for when subtlety has failed and time is short. This did not improve anything. The grazers did not need a larger opening. They needed a path. And the path was already there. The breach was a needle hole, and the thread had begun to slide. Over the next day, the symptoms deepened. Not for everyone at once. That would have been dramatic. And drama is rarely how systems fail. It happened unevenly. A person would seem fine in the morning and then sit down at midday as if their legs had been quietly dismissed from service. A voice would go flat and stay flat. A face would become oddly calm, not in peace, in absence. The water counter stopped counting. At first, this was simply because the numbers would not stay in order. They would begin at 1 and arrive at 3 with no memory of 2. Then they would forget what the numbers were for. Then they would forget they were holding a vessel and only notice the weight when it slipped and cracked on the ground. They looked at the broken vessel with mild surprise, as if it belonged to someone else. The reed cutter sat down and began plaiting nothing. Their hands moved in familiar motions. Their fingers remembered the work, even as the mind behind the fingers drifted. When someone spoke to them, their eyes lifted politely, unfocused, and then lowered again, as if the words had been too heavy to pick up. The ash carrier became careful. Not with ash, with speech. They began choosing words slowly, then stopped choosing at all. A sentence would begin and then trail off. Not because they were interrupted, because the thread of it had been eaten. The chief responded as chiefs do, with more insistence. They called more gatherings. They demanded more agreement. They repeated instructions and grew angry when repetition did not produce obedience. Their anger raised the emotional charge in the group, which made the air tighter, which made the grazers' work easier. Panic is generous like that. It helps everyone. The breach remained the same size. The effect spread. Far from the settlement, across distances that would have felt comforting if anyone had been able to feel comfort, something else registered the change. The world has caretakers who do not live in villages and do not measure their days by weather. They measure by coherence, by silence, by whether the boundary between layers is holding as designed. Their senses are tuned to what the settlement could not even suspect was there. When the breach formed, it did not appear to them as a story. It appeared as pain. A sharp discordance in a structure that is meant to remain smooth. A flare in a region that should have stayed quiet. Silence, impossibly loud in the wrong key. That flare did not explain itself. It did not come with a map. It simply existed. Bright enough to be noticed. Ugly enough to be urgent. Back in the settlement, the grazers continued. They did not hurry. They did not rage. They did not celebrate. They fed the way vermin always feed. Quietly. Purr.
Chapter 8. Containment Action.
QD02-08. Containment Action. Quiv 1 of 4. Something in the air changed before anyone saw anything. Not weather, not light, not even that familiar prickling you get when a room full of people is about to argue. This was cleaner than that, more structural, as if a pressure had been applied to the day from a direction the day did not normally have. The breach remained where it was, small, wrong, patient. The grazers continued their quiet work. The affected sat and stared and breathed and forgot. The rest tried to make plans with minds that were starting to slip at the edges. The shaman kept their rhythm because the rhythm was the only thing they still believed in. The chief kept speaking because speech is what leaders reach for when reality stops complying. Then the silence deepened. Not louder. Organized. The first sign of Den 42 was not a sound or a shape. Den 42 arrived as a subtraction, like the sensation of too much attention being removed from the air, as if the world had finally remembered it had boundaries and had decided to enforce them. People looked around. This achieved nothing, which is the usual result of looking around. Den 42 did not fit into the story. They did not come from the path. They did not step out of the trees. They were simply there. In the same way a mountain is there once you notice it. The mind did the work of catching up. Perspective adjusted. Pride shrank. A few people found themselves holding their breath and resented it, because holding your breath is a form of agreement. They were tall, impossibly tall, not in a way that invited awe, in a way that made measurement feel childish, which was worse. They did not carry weapons, nothing obvious, nothing for the eye to cling to. Their danger was not a tool, it was a discipline. Dayan 42 did not look at the breach first. They listened to everything else. This was the part humans never understand. The instinct is to stare at the wound. The real work is to assess the body around it. Their attention moved in 3 directions at once, not figuratively, practically. They could feel what had been done. They could feel what was still being done. They could feel what would continue to happen if nothing changed. The difficult part was not seeing the future. It was sorting which futures were real enough to matter. Probability is not a single road. It is a bundle of paths that collapses only when forced. The ritual had forced it. The breach had forced it again. The grazers were forcing it continuously. Each mouthful taken from minds that were supposed to carry ordinary tomorrows. Dayan 42 did not speak. They began. The human problem was simple, not morally, mechanically. Humans were still feeding the event, with fear, with repetition, with ceremony, with the insistence that if they continued hard enough, the world would comply. Dayan 42 approached the circle and did not acknowledge its shape. The circle had meaning to the humans. It had no authority in itself. One of the shaman raised their hands. The gesture was old, familiar, useful for handling other humans. Dayan 42 did not react. A presence moved, not fast, decisive. The shaman's hands lowered without memory of lowering them. No blow, no shove, a correction. Applied to posture the way you correct a child's grip on a knife. Firm. Unarguable. Strangely gentle, if you ignore the absence of consent. The chief opened their mouth. Nothing came out. Then something did. It was the wrong sound. Thin, strained. The chief coughed and tried again. Dayan 42 did not look at them. They looked at the practitioners. Isolation began as repositioning. Two shaman moved 3 paces apart. Not dragged, not thrown. Relocated. Like pieces on a board the humans had not known they were standing on. The ritual cadence broke, not interrupted, terminated. Like a finger pressed to a vibrating string. The rhythm failed. It spun, then stopped. The settlement reacted. A gasp. A cry. Someone stepped forward as if to catch the ritual. They could not. Local nullification was not spectacular. It was administrative. It was the removal of permission. Nothing came out. Then something did. It was the wrong sound. Thin. Strained. The chief coughed and tried again. Dayan 42 did not look at them. They looked at the practitioners. Isolation began as repositioning. Two shaman moved 3 paces apart. Not dragged, not thrown, relocated. Like pieces on a board the humans had not known they were standing on. The ritual cadence broke, not interrupted, terminated. Like a finger pressed to a vibrating string. The rhythm failed. It spun, then stopped. The settlement reacted. A gasp. A cry. Someone stepped forward as if to catch the ritual. They could not. Local nullification was not spectacular. It was administrative. It was the removal of permission. Whatever had been forced into dissonance returned to baseline. Breath became private again. Fear loosened. Attention stopped pooling. The air softened. The circle became reeds on dirt. Several people swayed, suddenly exhausted, as if released from holding up a roof they had never agreed to support. The chief looked for blame and found only consequence. Human interference ceased. With the human signal gone, the deeper work became possible. Not easier. Possible. The breach remained, small, structurally loud. Dayan 42 treated the grazers not as enemies, but as vermin, a problem of access. Boundary enforcement followed, not a wall, a rule. The surface changed, the grazers lost purchase. Removal occurred not as pursuit, but as shear. To a human eye, almost nothing happened. To a human body, it felt like the sudden absence of a headache you had forgotten. The breach resisted closure, not from will, from physics. Paths persist unless unmade. Dayon 42 unmade it. They worked in the middle. They shifted phase. The point of disagreement could no longer hold. The needle hole narrowed. Not visibly, conceptually. The air agreed with itself again. Depth stabilized. Light behaved. The sense of being listened to receded. Only the knowledge remained. That knowledge was not comforting.
Chapter 9. Stabilization.
Day 42 lingered at the site after the loud work was finished. This was deliberate. There is no advantage in leaving directly after peak chaos if your task is to determine what remains broken once everyone else has stopped touching it. Day 42 preferred systems after they had exhausted their capacity for surprise. They stood just outside the former circle, where the ground still remembered being arranged, and let their attentions settle. The settlement registered them again, belatedly. A few people noticed the height. Fewer noticed the stillness. Almost none noticed the way the air around him behaved more politely than elsewhere. Day 42 did not acknowledge them. Not out of disdain, out of triage. The breach had closed. But closure is not repair. It is a state change, not a solution. Threads that have been forced apart retain memory of that separation. Left alone, they will attempt it again, usually at the worst possible moment. Day 42 knelt. This startled the humans far more than his arrival had. They had expected proclamation, or judgment, or at least a look that could be interpreted later as meaning something. Instead, he placed one long hand flat against the ground, as if checking whether a floor was still load-bearing. He listened. Not to sound, to residue. The veil in this region had thinned and then been bruised. The difference matters. Thin can be corrected gently. Bruised requires patience. Because bruises fade on their own timescale, whether you approve of that timescale or not. Day 42 rose and made a small, precise adjustment to the local field. Nothing visible happened. This was the point. Harmonic seals are not barriers. They are agreements imposed on matter that matter does not realize it has consented to. The seal did not prevent interaction. It altered the cost of interaction, until the path of least resistance once again pointed away from catastrophe. Day 42 set the first anchor, then the second, then stopped. 3 anchors would have been reassuring. Humans like odd numbers and symmetry. 2 anchors are less satisfying, but significantly safer. A third would have introduced unnecessary rigidity, and rigidity is how systems snap when stressed again. A human approached him. This was inevitable. The human did not speak at first. They hovered in that uncertain zone where curiosity wrestles with self-preservation. Day 42 allowed the hover to continue long enough to be educational. Eventually, the human asked the wrong question. Is it over? Day 42 considered this. Not because it was difficult, because it was the wrong unit of measure. He did not answer. The metamaterial of his helmet flickered. For a fraction of a second, the terrifying animalistic visage collapsed into something markedly worse, an expression best described as existential dread. Then the animal face reasserted itself, fierce, correct. The correction was immediate. Unfortunately, it was also noticeable. Dayen-42 was annoyed. This happened with all of his helmets, no matter the iteration, no matter the calibration. They occasionally did this, usually at inopportune moments. To a Va'ari Dayen, the embarrassment was comparable to being observed without armor, in a compromising position, by someone who would absolutely remember it incorrectly. Instead, he adjusted the second anchor by a fraction invisible even to careful instruments. The local resonance softened. A faint pressure in the air eased. Several people breathed out without realizing they had been holding anything in. Dayen-42 stood. He addressed the human at last. "Interference has ceased," he said. This was true. It was also unhelpful, which made it the correct level of help for the circumstances. He moved to the perimeter of the former breach and traced its geometry, not as it had been, but as it now preferred to be. The shape resisted briefly. Dayen-42 applied no force. He waited. This was where his four-dimensional perception mattered. He could feel the immediate present, still ringing with after-effects. He could feel the past, folded tightly into the sight, carrying memory like tension in a bent wire. He could feel the future as a scatter of probabilities, some heavier, some already shedding weight as the system relaxed. The difficult work was not seeing all of this. It was choosing which future to privilege. Dayen-42 selected a path that did not optimize outcomes. It merely reduced risk. The seal settled, not permanently, not cleanly, but sufficiently. The veil here would hold if left alone. It would fail if provoked. It would degrade if used as a teaching example. It would become dangerous again if someone decided they understood what had happened. Dayen-42 accepted these conditions. He always did. He stepped back and surveyed the settlement one last time. The affected still breathed. Some would recover a semblance of humanity. Most would not. That calculation had already been made upstream. Revisiting it now would serve no function. The grazers were gone. The breach was closed. The system had not been fixed. It had been stabilized. Conditionally.
Chapter 10. Final Report and Closing Record. The containment was successful. Local harmonic stability was restored to within acceptable variance. The breach was closed. Predatory access was terminated. Residual contamination remains within predicted tolerances and will decay naturally if not re-stimulated. This outcome is typical. What is also typical is the human response to it. Several individuals attempted to attribute meaning to the intervention. Some inferred judgment. Others inferred protection. A few inferred approval. None of these inferences were encouraged. None were corrected. Correction would have required explanation. Explanation produces signal. Humans persist in believing that causality and meaning are aligned. They are not. Meaning is an after-action artifact generated by cognition under stress. Causality operates independently and with considerably less interest in narrative satisfaction. In this instance, humans interpreted restraint as mercy. This is a common error. QD02-10, Final Report, Quiv 2 of 2. Dane 42, Stentorian Delivery. QD02-10, Final Report, Quiv 2 of 2. Restraint is a load-bearing discipline. It exists to prevent further escalation, not to comfort the escalator. The ritual did not fail because the desire was illegitimate. It failed because the method was structurally incompatible with the outcome sought. This distinction was visible at the moment of decision. It was irrelevant thereafter. The fact that the settlement remains extant should not be mistaken for validation. It is a temporary condition. I note again the recurrent pattern: uncertainty followed by impatience, followed by symbolic action, followed by unintended access, followed by surprise. Humans do not lack intelligence. They lack tolerance for unresolved states. This continues to be irritating. Event classification, containment action to local nullification to harmonic seal. Disposition, successful. Residual risk, conditional. Follow-up, none recommended unless provoked. No further intervention is scheduled. The action is complete. The irritation remains.